Alright, so Curious George, it's a massive, big brain IQ show. Like, if you don't have the IQ, the brain capacity to understand it, then click off this video immediately, or your head will explode. Curious George, you're probably wondering why I'm talking about it. It's because the other day I got a sudden pang of nostalgia, remembering all that stuff about Curious George, all the indoctrination that was broadcast straight into my head through television. Part of that was this show about this curious little monkey who goes about and does different things. If you just watch it in the background, put it on for like your kids in the background, then you probably won't notice much about it. However, it actually is quite advanced. Like, there's some advanced topics, especially relating to math and different topics in math that are present in Curious George. And so today I want to take a look at those because honestly, as I look back on them, I realized, wow, that was actually quite useful in developing basic fundamental math and other important school subject ideas in my brain. The first episode I want to talk about is the one where Curious George goes to the toy store one day and they're holding this competition for people to estimate the amount of bouncy balls present in a bouncy ball dispenser rocket-shaped thing. Well, anyways, the bouncy balls are in this cylindrical container inside of this rocket-shaped toy thing. And Curious George catches wind of this really quickly, so he starts getting this cylindrical container in his house and starts filling it with all these balls and stuff. Then he realizes that, wait, oh no, the balls that I've been filling this cylindrical container with are all of different radii. You know, he's put a beach ball in there, he's got like a tennis ball in there and stuff. And he realizes, you know, these aren't the right size, and so I'm doing an inaccurate model of what I'm trying to estimate. Already here, we're looking at some pretty advanced, like, scientific method stuff. Like, Curious George here is trying to estimate not only just the amount of balls, but within a specific container, which he then starts measuring. Like, later in the episode, what he does is, I think this is probably one of the most genius Curious George moments out there, right? He gets a smaller container, which is about the same diameter as the rocket, and then he puts it up to the rocket and he's like, wait, like this is like a third or like a fourth of the actual container. And so what he can do is he can fill this smaller container with a bunch of marbles and stuff and then estimate that number. And then he can scale it up, like multiply it by 3 or multiply it by 4 or whatever it is in the episode. So then he can get an accurate model for how many balls there really are. Like, just that in and of itself is already quite advanced. And what Curious George is essentially doing here is not only demonstrating knowledge of how to estimate the amount of balls in a specific container, he's sort of estimating their density too, which is quite an advanced topic for like 7 to 5-year-old children, right? But anyways, at the end of the show, Curious George does win the competition with some help from a friend. And he shares all of the balls with all of the friends in the story. You know, there's like this wholesome family moment about sharing, but, you know, we're not here to talk about wholesome family values, we're here to talk about mathematics. And in fact, the next episode of Curious George is one that's even more interesting, I think. So basically, Curious George goes to the lake one day, he goes to the lake and, you know, his owner is like trying to fix a boat or something, and he's off to the side, you know, monkeying around as he usually does, and what he finds is this tiny little pond which is formed to the side of the lake, and in this pond, there are these fish. There's these little fish which are stuck in it. Well, there's one fish initially, and eventually he digs a canal to let the fish through because he's trying to get the fish to, you know, leave the canal. But what happens is more fish keep flowing in because then the water's flowing in from the other side. And so what Curious George does is he devises a double gate system using these oars that he finds from a boat. He has 2 oars, and then somebody teaches him, I think, about the double gate system, and he starts implementing this kind of double gate system where he lets the fish in and then closes one gate, then opens the other gate, and he deals with like water levels. They talk about water levels and stuff, and I don't know, maybe it's just me overthinking, but that is a quite advanced topic for kids to understand. Like, if I was left alone with that problem, I'd probably spend like 2 hours trying to grab the fish with my bare hands because I'm like a stupid kid who like butts his head into a problem until eventually it works, right? And Curious George does do that at the beginning of the show anyways, before coming up with this big-brained, high IQ solution, right? But anyways, at the end of the show, as you'd probably expect, he gets all of the fish out of the pond, they're finally back into the lake, and then we can move on to the next episode, which I think is even more interesting because it talks about the order of stuff. And I don't know much about math, but I think vaguely you could link this next episode to some topics in symmetry and group theory, but I'm not sure. So in this last episode I want to talk about, Curious George gets this fixation for model trains, and so he goes to a real-life train station where the conductor basically just leaves him at the helm of the entire train system of his county, I'm assuming, which, you know, if this happened in real life, there would be many deaths, and Curious George would be personally responsible for like families being torn apart, but don't look into it too much. The main lesson in this episode seems to be about the order of numbers, because in this episode, Curious George, there's all these trains running on the tracks, and his task is to make sure that the trains with the lowest number are the ones who get to the stations first. So the trains have to get there in consecutive order. So, train number 1 has to come, then train number 3, or train number 4, train number 5, so on and so forth. And whichever train is bigger goes after the other one. And there's no specific continuity here. He's not going 1, 2, 3, 4 in this episode. There's like 1, 2, 3, 4. Then there's like some really big train. I think it was like 365 or some like random number like that shows up in the middle of the episode. So Curious George isn't just looking at the order of numbers, how to count, but he's also trying to teach the audience about numbers being bigger than each other, which is, I guess that's kind of teaching kids something. But this episode gets even more interesting when you realize that the way Curious George is changing the order of these trains is by switching them to different tracks and making the trains surpass each other. And there's some pretty complicated moments in here. At the end of the day, the conductor has to be called in, and he's the one who sorts everything, and all the trains go back in order. But still, I don't know about you, but this seems like it could be a pretty complicated, symmetry or puzzle that you could solve with real math. Like, all the trains are on different tracks, and you have to figure out what's the fastest way to switch them to different tracks, so by the time they get to the station, they're all in the right order. Like, in my mind, I could probably come up with a few configurations where you could set up some tracks in a certain way, and the trains maybe have a set speed or something. All these sort of thoughts. You wouldn't expect these to be triggered from a Curious George episode, but they are. And the reason for this is because I think, especially in children's television nowadays, there seems to be a real lack of focus on complex concepts that are presented as like easy little things to kids. Like something like the Curious George train ordering exercise, right? You could feasibly change that into a much more complicated, even like college math level problem. And that's what I like about Curious George. I joke about it being a high IQ, big brain. You gotta have like a certain IQ. You gotta be at least IQ 150 to understand Curious George, to even begin to fathom what Curious George is actually up to in these episodes. Like he's contacting deities or weirdo stuff like that. I joke about that, but in reality, these things are actually helping kids understand math better, in my opinion. And so I'm glad that whoever makes these Curious George episodes is making them as well as they are. Now, nowadays, the show is pretty much all Flash animated as far as I can tell. Like, it's all computer animated, and it's more focused on science stuff rather than math stuff, and maybe a few like lessons about ecology or stuff like that. So I think it sort of lost its magic. The only reason I know this is because I went to see a few new George episodes to understand what's going on in the George lore. There wasn't much of interest there. It's kind of sad, it seems to have kind of died, but the episodes that are cool, the ones that I remember from my childhood, they're still being aired on television, and I think they're a pretty good learning experience. But anyways, I've been Denshi. That was my video on why Curious George is a big brain, high IQ TV show. Goodbye.
Thank you.